Joining us in the studio this morning is our county prosecutor from Twin Falls County, Grant Loebs. He does this, of course, on a monthly basis on a Tuesday morning with us. And you're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And Bill Colley with you, too, as well on Top Story. And at 7 minutes after 9 o'clock, we have 58. Right off the top, I guess the smart aleck in me realizes that probably the question is, so anything exciting happened in your life over the last 72 hours?
It's been a busy week. It's really been a busy couple weeks because, we've had one major thing follow close on the heels of another. But it keeps everything busy. We're running around trying to keep up with everything and trying to do our job and trying to respond to questions from the public and from the press. And, I went to the city council meeting last night and observed that. And there's a lot of anger, frustration, misinformation, and both the police and my office have been trying to keep up with that.
Well, I was listening at home last night to the web stream from the meeting, and I heard people get up, and obviously they were angry, as you point out, and some of them were denouncing you. But it struck me that a lot of them are doing that because they don't really know what your job is all about. I mean, they know that you put people away, that's primarily what the job is about, or at least that you try to convince people not to do it again.
Right.
But I think that, unfortunately, the public just doesn't understand that there are certain limits sometimes to what you do.
Right. And, you mentioned that at the meeting there were some people, excuse me, a lot of people were being denounced. And again, people are frustrated, people are afraid, people are angry about what has happened, and that's understandable. And they were blaming the city council for it. They were blaming certain city councilmen for it. They were blaming the police for it. They were blaming my office and me personally for it. And I couldn't quite understand all of what that was about, other than it was just anger. In part, I think there was some anger that the police hadn't called a press conference about this, or we hadn't released a lot of information about it. And that is, I think, goes back to your question about the fundamental misunderstanding as to what we're supposed to be doing. And there are times when we have to make comments to the public, and that's fine. I actually would rather explain something to the public than have to tell them all the time that I can't talk about it because it'll jeopardize the case, or because there's a protective order on the case, or the case is sealed, or something like that, because that always sounds to people like, well, you're hiding stuff. Well, the system can't function if everything the police know when they know it is public. They can't do an investigation. If they hold a press conference and explain everything that they're doing and all that they're gathering and what they're considering in trying to decide to charge somebody, or how the case is going, and what the newest information is, that jeopardizes the ability to do the case. And the second part of that is, if you engage in that, it jeopardizes the ability to have a fair trial. And of course, it shines often unwanted light on victims' families, especially in a case where they're children, as in this case in Fawnbrook. And then thirdly, in this case, because it deals with juveniles, the court has sealed the court filings. Now, that doesn't mean they have sealed everything, because the court order to seal the court filings doesn't seal the ability of the police to talk about some aspects of it, but it seals my ability to talk about specifically what charges were filed, what evidence we have, what documents we filed, what hearings are happening and how they're happening, the ages, names, other information about the defendants and also the victims. And so when the court does that, we have to be very careful about what we say. And some of what even that I said yesterday probably gets close to the line on that. But when there's so much misinformation about something, I think it's important to at least say, this is not what happened. That is not what we're dealing with. And that information is not correct. But at the same time, I really can't, because of the court order and because of the other the other concerns that I mentioned, go into a lot of detail about it.
I think too sometimes there's a confusion among the public. The bloggers were using the word rape, but it's a little bit like homicide. I tried to explain this in a post I did last night at our website. If somebody knows that someone was killed on the street, the vernacular says my neighbor was murdered,
Hmm.
but murdered is just a degree of homicide. There are several different homicides, and so it could
Well,
be
murder is a
manslaughter.
crime.
Right,
Homicide just means a person was killed by another person.
right,
I mean, if I'm walking along the street and you come at me with a shotgun and I draw my gun and shoot you and kill you, that's a homicide, but it's not a murder. It's not a crime, because I would be within my rights to have used self-defense if you tried to kill me with a shotgun. So, homicide's the generic term used to mean a person killed another person,
right.
but it doesn't say that it's a crime. Now, murder is always a crime.
But just in attacks, rape is a degree of an attack, but it's not necessarily all attacks.
Right. And and there are a lot of things like kidnapping, for instance. There are kidnappings that we have charged, which do not meet the generally accepted public idea of what a kidnapping is. Kidnapping is, you sneak into the house, you steal the Lindbergh baby, you send a ransom note with letters cut out from various magazines. That's what people think a kidnapping is. That isn't necessarily what the law is about kidnapping. And the same is true with rape. People have an idea in their heads about what rape is, but the technical legal definition of rape might not conform to what the layperson thinks it is. Um, but in any case, a lot of the national kind of bloggers, I guess they are, had this case in Twin Falls so wrong, and it made Twin Falls look very bad. I think it made the case look really unrecognizable from what the people who were working on it know it to be. And at some point, it just became necessary for both me and then later in the evening, the police chief to talk about it and correct it.
Well, I was over the weekend. I was looking. I just had seen a blog, so I started typing in certain search keywords into Google. And during the course of about, this started Saturday, and by Sunday, I was watching this snowball, and then Drudge Report yesterday morning. It's a bit like watching a pandemic spread, where the virus just suddenly goes from, or 0 to 60
Right.
in somebody's car. It just was amazing how this thing just to use another analogy, snowballed over the weekend, and then by Monday morning, it was like, holy mackerel.
Yeah, and part of that, and I think part of the frustration among some of the public that are sincerely concerned here, um, not the people that are might be using it for some kind of political statement, but the people that are really concerned, and I don't discount that. There are a lot of those people, uh, but part of the problem is that they hear a thing happened, they ask questions, answers aren't given because of the concerns I mentioned to you before. I mean, the police aren't going to tell you exactly what's happening because they're in the middle of an investigation. I can't tell you what's happening because I'm in the middle of analyzing what they've investigated and have all kinds of rules on me to not say things about it. And so there's a rumor that something happened. The rumor gets bigger and bigger. It has elements of truth in it for sure, but also elements that are either conjecture or, in this case, kind of flat made up. And so people get worried and they start repeating what they've heard. And so it spreads naturally like that. And really, most of the major cases we have over the years have an element of that. But this one really took off in a different direction. And the sad thing, in part, is that it detracts from the fact that this is a really serious incident. This is an actual victim who was actually victimized in a very terrible way, and the police are actually doing a good job finding out exactly what happened, and we're in the midst of working a criminal case about what actually happened, and all this misinformation kind of detracts from the reality of it. And the victim's family then has to read things that didn't happen. Then they have to read statements by me and by the police that say, well, that's not what really happened, and it sounds like it's being minimized, when in fact, we are treating this as a very serious case.
Social media, what it has wrought, though, Our mutual acquaintance, Bill Fitzpatrick, once told me, he said that with the rise of social media, he has never had to prosecute more harassment cases. He just said because people get angry and they send an email and there's an arrest then because of harassment or threats made, which didn't exist before social media. But social media also has generated this echo chamber where we ended up yesterday, as you say, being on the Drudge Report. You made a comment to one of the newspapers. They called you and you were reading it literally
Yeah.
on Drudge at the same time.
Yeah. Syrian refugees rape 5-year-old at knife point is what the Drudge Report headline was, and none of that was true. And by saying, well, there weren't Syrian refugees involved, that doesn't mean that there wasn't something bad and some people didn't do a bad thing, but they weren't Syrians. And one of the people last night at the city council meeting said, who cares if they weren't Syrians? They were somebody and they did a horrible thing. That's exactly my point. I don't care if they're Syrians or not, but the fact that it's spread out there among the public that they are Syrians adds fuel to the fire because it links this incident with another issue, which is obviously a very touchy, sensitive, controversial issue, that being whether Syrians should be admitted to this country as refugees. And this case has nothing to do with that. It has nothing to do with whether Syrians should be here as refugees. And well, what if they're Muslims? I don't care if they're Muslims. I mean, I understand that's a public issue that is being debated, and that's fine. I have opinions about that like other people do. But in terms of prosecuting this case, I don't care if they're Muslims or Christians or Jews or I don't care what they are. If they've done a bad thing to an innocent victim, they need to be held accountable for that. And it won't add one bit to the way I present this case to know what religion they are.
And again, I would assume that because of the preponderance, this is still an overwhelmingly white country and most people profess to be Christians, that in most assault cases you have, most of those involve Caucasians who are likely Christians just because of the overwhelming numbers. So someone's background doesn't necessarily mean
Well, sure,
that they have a certain pattern of behavior.
And that of course is true. We unfortunately the fact that a juvenile or juveniles have attacked another juvenile in a sexual way, whether you call that rape or lewd and lascivious conduct or whatever, that is not a rare thing. I mean, we prosecute a number of those every year, and over the past 20 years, I've prosecuted dozens and dozens of those. And it's a sad thing when it happens, whoever the person is who does it, but almost all of those are Caucasians on Caucasians over the years.
We have more coming up with Grant Loebs, Twin Falls County prosecutor. It's 20 minutes after 9 o'clock. 58, Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. Joining us in studio is Twin Falls County prosecutor Grant Loebs. Right now, of course, coming up on 925, Bill Colley with you as well on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Quick reminder, we'll have either Dr. Jonathan Tripp or one of his associates in studio with us tomorrow between 8:30 and 9 o'clock. And the doctor is on his way in a few weeks to Nicaragua as part of a mission trip. He's taking along his sons, too, as well. And they are looking to pay their own way, and that means they have to mow a lot of grass this summer. So if you need someone to actually take care of that for you, they would be willing to do that. You can drop by the doctor's office and set that up. And they're also looking for toiletries to take along on the trip. His office is located on Fillmore Street, directly across from the main post office in Twin Falls. And I hope you can do them a favor and help them out in this particular, you call it a mission of mercy, if you will. Right now it's 59. Bill Colley with you with Grant Loebs this morning. And, we had actually planned to talk about some other things today. There was a rumor, if I can throw this at you, over the weekend that Clarence Thomas was going to retire from the Supreme Court. And then his wife yesterday said, no, he's got no intention of going anytime soon. But this week is big week at the Supreme Court.
Right. They're finishing up all of the cases that they've been holding all this time. And it usually means they're going to release the most controversial cases at the end. That's
Thursday.
Their typical way of doing it, yeah.
Thursday this week.
Yeah.
And there'll be a couple today. I think there's 11 total, but a couple today, a couple tomorrow, and then the big three maybe on Thursday that are expected to come down. 2 cases out of Texas, and one case dealing with the president's efforts to,
The,
I guess, wave a fig leaf and get
right.
people
The immigration
right.
executive orders, and then the two abortion cases, I think, are out of Texas, aren't they? Or it's
Right.
one of and then there's well, they declared they weren't going to hear some, uh, and therefore waiting essentially until the new justice is appointed before they do that. And then they declared flat out they're not going to take up some, just let the lower courts rulings stand. But I think, yeah, later this week you're going to hear some of the controversial ones, and it'll be interesting to see what they do with their, 8-person court. Um,
But the thing is, it didn't come to an end. The world didn't come to an end as many people predicted without Scalia there hearing these cases.
no, and of course it didn't. I mean, as we all know, there isn't anything in the Constitution that mandates the number of justices. That's just the way it's been for so long that we assume that the court has to have 9 justices. And we generally think that it should have 9 or 7 or something odd so that there's not a bunch of tie votes. But tie votes actually do have effect. I mean, if there's a tie vote in the Supreme Court, then the lower court ruling is sustained. So a tie isn't irrelevant, it's a decision. So, yeah, obviously the world didn't come to an end, but for conservatives, the world will come to an end if Justice Thomas retires and Hillary Clinton wins and appoints somebody for that spot as well as for Scalia's spot. So it is good news for conservatives that he says he's not retiring.
Glenn Urquhart, who worked for Ronald Reagan and built all of the underground structures in Washington for security, White House, Executive Office Building, and I think even around the Capitol, once told me, he said, you can have just one Supreme Court justice. And that justice, that one justice, could decide every case that would come before the court. Now, obviously, that hasn't happened, but I think that backs up what you say. There's no real number, and
Right.
Franklin Roosevelt actually tried to raise it to 15.
Right. Which, would have been legal. It's just that people saw it for what it was, an attempt to pack the court with people who had his position and therefore overwhelm the people that were there. Um, but there isn't any preclusion against having 15, or frankly, there's no requirement that there be an odd number. There could be 10. You could stay with 8 if you wanted to. But I think that that's unlikely. I think that the number 9 has been ingrained in society for so long, and that will be the number we have in our lifetime.
And I did read where Justice Kagan, at least on one of these cases this week, recuses herself because of her previous experience.
So there will be a 7 member court deciding that case.
So then you could actually get a majority versus a tie.
Right. And of course, in all Supreme Courts, whether it's Idaho court or the U.S. Supreme Court, there are times when judges recuse themselves from a thing, and then cases are decided with fewer votes. So it is not the end of the world. I think the end of the world rhetoric is twofold. One, conservative who thinks it's the end of the world because Scalia's gone and now we might lose a lot of things. And two, liberals who think it's the end of the world because they want to say it's the end of the world so that the Supreme Court vacancy is filled by Obama before the election. So they're both saying that because of their political views.
And it doesn't look like it's having much of an impact on the public either way at the moment.
No, not so far. And, because they're not going to see any damage as a result of it, at least right now. We'll see once the election is held in November and the new president takes over in January. That will be a big, big change depending upon who the president is.
Got more with Grant Loebs on the way. You're listening to Top Story with Bill Colley on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and NewsRadio1310.com. It's 9:30, and it's 59. Our guest during this half hour of the program, Grant Loebs. He is the Twin Falls County prosecutor. You're listening to News Radio 1310, KLIX, and NewsRadio1310.com, and it's, well, hey, we've had a huge spike of the temperature. According to what I'm looking at, we've jumped to 70. So if there had been any cloud cover apparently holding us back, that's moved out of the way. And our telephone number, 736-0300, 736-0300. While you're in studio with us, obviously, because of your job, you have a concentration in constitutional law. After Orlando, it failed yesterday. There were 4, obviously, gun provisions in the Senate that didn't make it. But one of these things that's been bandied about, it's proposed by Susan Collins, who's a rather she's described as a moderate Republican from Maine.
Right.
She proposed denying gun sales to people on the no-fly list. Today, the Heritage Foundation says you simply can't do it because of the U.S. Constitution.
Well, because a couple of things. One, the constitutional argument that being there's no due process, you can't fight that because you're on the no-fly list, and there's really no due process for that. And so, if you deny a constitutional right to somebody without giving them any way to argue the matter or to fight it or to have a hearing about it, then I think that's what the Heritage Foundation's point is. The other thing is the people on the no-fly list don't know they're on the no-fly list often, and the no-fly list is just simply a security precaution that the people who are on the FBI's list for suspected terrorism or other criminal activity will be put on the no-fly list by the FBI just so that they don't get on a plane and do something crazy, and they don't get a notice in the mail that says the FBI has placed you on the no-fly list because it's usually in the midst of an ongoing investigation that they get there. So, like we were talking about before, with the reason why the police can't just always hold a press conference and tell everybody everything that's going on, the FBI doesn't hold a press conference and say, we've added the following 28 people to the no-fly list today, because obviously that gives information to what is largely now terrorists who are on that list. So I think there are all kinds of problems with her plan to do that, and I don't think it's going to go anywhere. But I think, as you pointed out, Susan Collins is a moderate Republican from Maine. Her career is based upon her argument that she can work both sides of the aisle, that she's comfortable working with Democrats and working with Republicans. I think this was an attempt to come up with a gun control idea that didn't take guns from people like you and I who are law abiding people, but added a measure of security for those who are worried about anybody having guns. And I think it just doesn't work for the reasons we mentioned, but I think that's what she was trying to do.
And then you had the senator from, is it Chris Murphy from Connecticut?
Yeah, Connecticut guy
And
doing his filibuster thing.
Doing his filibuster, and he got caught up on an interview over the weekend where someone pointed out that all of his proposals would not have mattered in either Orlando or San Bernardino.
Right.
So it's all for show, isn't it?
Well, it's not for show. They mean it. I mean, they are intent on restricting gun rights, and it's not for show. It's more using those incidents as an excuse to push the anti-gun agenda, and that's clearly what it was. And the fact that they wouldn't have prevented it comes out every time. I mean, almost all of these people that are engaged in these mass shootings either got their guns legally or they got them through some illegal means that wouldn't have been prevented by the law anyway, because they're intent on shooting a bunch of people. They you don't really stop those kind of determined terrorist people by having laws that prevent law-abiding people from carrying guns, because they're not going to abide by them.
We have a caller with us. Caller, we've got about a minute and a half before the break. You're on the air.
Yes, Mr. Loeb. I was just curious, are we or do you know of are we under a higher security level now than before Orlando, people in Idaho? I mean, has it been raised anything in Idaho, or?
Well, anytime an incident like that happens, there is coordination nationwide with federal law enforcement people, and the federal law enforcement people do confer with the local law enforcement about what the security risks are. I don't know that there's a specific higher threat level been issued because of that shooting, but anytime there's anything, whether it's public, whether a shooting happens, or whether there's a lot of chatter on the internet about we're going to do something, or one of the big anniversaries comes up, there is it's not like a threat level thing. It's not like it goes from orange to red or something, but there is constant information exchange between the people who hear the threatening information and the local law enforcement, so that everybody can be on guard for it. But I don't think there's anything that private citizens would notice.
I want to thank you for the call. We've got a break coming up shortly, and I know that some of the sheriff's deputies have told me that they have already gone through some extensive training where they would be able to spot things like this long before even San Bernardino, much less Orlando. And so there are constant programs that are going on, not only, I guess, at the local level, but with state police too.
And that's been ongoing since 9/11, really. And there is all kinds of constant upgrade in training for people that are first responders and police. You know, the governor's office, the National Guard, all those people have had a lot of extra training that started way back after 9/11.
We've got more with Grant Loebs coming up. One more segment of the show on Top Story. Also with Bill Colley on News Radio 1310 KLIX and NewsRadio1310.com. And I'm going to call it 71. Our studio guest is Grant Loebs. He is the county prosecutor in Twin Falls County. Bill Colley with you as well on News Radio 1310 KLIX and NewsRadio1310.com. Telephone number if you'd like to reach the prosecutor before the hour ends, 736-0300. That's 736-0300, 944, and we've got 71. Just very quickly, I know it's a personal matter, but you were telling me that your son graduated college and you were off to Vermont for a couple of days, and that's got to be a good feeling when you get to that point and all of a sudden you realize, okay, they're on their own now.
It's a scary feeling because for two reasons. One, you realize they're on their own now, which is scary because who is he to be on his own? Secondly, it really kind of accentuates how much older you are because I
Right.
can't even imagine that I have a child that's already graduated from college. But, he did very well, and it was fun to go back there and see that. And it was. It was kind of a break, but it was really fast paced. I mean, there was a lot to do, and I had to help him pack, had to help him move his stuff. I mean, it's funny they graduate you at noon on Sunday, and then they tell you you got till 11 o'clock p.m. to get everything out of the dang place because they're gonna lock the doors and kick you out. And it's like you lived there for 4 years and you got all this stuff, and it was a marathon packing session for sure.
I know that in my own experience, I think that I packed everything into the car on a Friday night, graduated on Saturday morning, and slept in an empty room,
Yeah.
and then just
Well, he did
kept.
that largely, but he had so much stuff that it couldn't all go in a car, and plus he's out in the middle of nowhere. So we had to take 17 boxes of stuff to the U-Haul place and mail it to my house. And so by the time I got back, I had piles of UPS boxes on my front doorstep, and it was
The one nice thing about Middlebury, though, it's got that series of small waterfalls.
yeah, it's a pretty place.
It is just
Yeah,
beautiful. I used to
yeah.
take my daughter and niece there for ice cream, so I know a little bit about the area. We're wrapping up our program today with about just under 15 minutes to go. We've touched on a lot of topics. I emailed you one the other day. One of my old bosses left the broadcasting business, and he's now selling something that I guess that's akin to legal insurance.
Mm.
What a person does is they come to his office, he sells them a policy, and then they pay a flat fee every month. And that flat fee, if they need a lawyer in 6 months, it pays for the lawyer. If they need a lawyer in 6 years, it pays for the lawyer. But he says this is done because a lot of people simply can't afford a great big throw all at
Hmm.
once with
Hmm.
legal costs. Have you ever heard of anything like this being done before?
Yes, in fact, there was a service offered to Twin Falls County people where you could pay extra out of your paycheck and you would get this kind of on-call lawyer thing a while ago. And it's not a bad idea. You don't get necessarily to pick who your lawyer is. You don't get a specialist lawyer necessarily. But I never used it, so I don't know what I would have gotten had I had a legal problem. But yeah, I can understand why it's an attractive product because if you get in trouble or you need to have a contested divorce or you need to fight a will or something like that, and you pick up the phone and you ask a lawyer how much that is, that's going to be we need this much up front and we need this much as we go and we need this much at the end. So it can be a lot of money. And if you've got one kind of on a monthly retainer where it takes a little bit out of your paycheck every month, I can see why that might be a good idea.
It shouldn't hurt the quality of your representation either, though, because
No, not necessarily.
like
It
an
all
insurance
depends on who the
company,
lawyer is.
right, it pays
Yeah,
out the money that lawyer would demand.
right.
And so therefore you don't have to worry about skimping on the cost of it at all.
Right, and it always depends on the actual lawyer that you get. I mean, you can pay a lot for a bad lawyer just as much as you can pay a little for a good lawyer. It's all personality and work ethic and competence and intelligence, and there's no reason why that would lead to a bad lawyer.
Now, speaking of law, and this gets back to your office. We talked about Supreme Court earlier. A lot of people probably aren't aware of this, but you don't have to be a lawyer to be a justice of the Supreme Court. On the other hand, to be the prosecutor in Twin Falls County, I would assume you have to have a law degree, right?
To be a prosecutor in Idaho, you have to be admitted to the bar and a member of the bar in good standing. In some states, that's not true. In some states, because the head prosecutor is so much of that work is administrative and budgetary and policy setting. You don't have to even be a lawyer. Now, if you're a prosecutor in one of those states, you can and you're not a lawyer, you can't go into court though. I mean, you can't try a case. You can't, do the legal things that lawyers are able to do with their license. But you can run the office, and you can supervise other people. It becomes more of a CEO kind of a job, rather than a job where you're also active in making the legal decisions and doing the legal work.
Well, I bring that up because one of the uh, folks at last night's council meeting was looking to find someone to challenge you in
Oh
November's
yeah.
election. And since you don't have an opponent in the general election as a Democrat, no Democrat obviously wanted the job. Is there any time left? I mean, could you see someone? Is there still a filing period where an independent could pop up?
No, the filing periods are all over. Um, to get on the ballot, a person for any elective position in Idaho, you can run as a write-in up until late in the game, but you can't get on the ballot after the primaries are over, because that's the point of the primaries, is to put people on the ballot. So you could have run as an independent or as
Mhm.
a Democrat or as a Constitution Party person by winning that party's primary, and then you'd be on the ballot.
But this is I think something to note. We talked earlier about how the general public, I think, oftentimes does not understand what your job is all about, and that's probably the corollary there is they don't understand how anybody would go about challenging for that job, and it does. I hate to say this, it shows us that perhaps we've failed people with civics education at some point.
Well, I mean, I think I don't know. I mean, I think it's kind of obvious. It's an elected position. We just had a primary where I was challenged, as was the sheriff and two of our three county commissioners. The process worked. Some people, some incumbents won, some incumbents lost, and that dealt with, of course, just the primary. Only one of those now has a challenge in November, and that is the race for county commission for, I think that's the third district, um, and that's the Jack Johnson, who will be challenged by Jill Scheme in as a Democrat in for that position. So I think that anybody who's paying attention at all understands that we have an elective system, and that there's usually two phases, a primary and a general election. Um, but I think what you're one of the things that you mentioned there, it is confusing to people when they ask, as I often hear, who's the sheriff's boss? Um, who is the prosecutor's boss? Who can fire the prosecutor? Well, as was mentioned by one of the city councilmen yesterday, I think Mr. Lanting said, well, the prosecutor is elected. You, the people, can fire him if you unelect him. But once he's elected, he doesn't have a boss any more than a senator has a boss, or a congressman has a boss, or a city councilman or a county commissioner has a boss. These people are independently elected. They're not hired by somebody above them. And I think that's a good system because it allows the most control at the local level. It's always interesting to me that people who a lot of times the people who are so anti-government are always looking for a higher government authority to order their local officials to do things. Um, you know, there's got to be somebody who can order our county commissioners to do something. I'm going to call the governor. Well, he can't order your county commissioners to do something. Well, I'm going to call a senator then. again, he's a federal officer. He can't order your county commissioners to do things.
Well, I worked at a county years ago where the locally elected sheriff went before the what they had a county council versus a commission or a legislature, and he had to go before the council. And one of the members of the council was upset with him about something and said, that's a terrible way to treat your bosses. And he said, I remind you, I am independently elected as you
Right.
are, and you're not the boss. But as a department head, which you also are, you have to go to the commission, though, still to talk budget
Right.
because they
The,
set the dollars and cents.
one of the jobs of the county commissioners is to set the budgets for all the offices, both the elected ones and the ones that are hired and appointed. Um, and with that power, there is occasionally the attempt to use that power to set policy. It certainly has happened throughout the state in various places, and those are usually places where the elected officials don't get along. That's never happened in Twin Falls County with any of the offices. It's certainly not to any significant extent. I mean, the commissioners here have always known that their job is to be fiscally responsible for a a conservative budget, and they give you a budget, and they don't try to tell you what to do with it in terms of how to do your job, and that is good because obviously the county commissioners are not prosecutors. They don't know what my job is to the level that they would need to run the office that way. So, and the same with the sheriff. I mean, if I were a county commissioner and I were trying to tell the sheriff how to do his job, that would be ridiculous. I don't know what the sheriff's job is. I don't know how to run a jail, and but the commissioners are responsible for making sure that you account for the money you spend and you do so responsibly.
I don't know that you're endorsing anyone, but come January, you could have two new county commissioners who do understand law enforcement, and one of them would know about running a jail. And in that situation, at least there would be people in that position who would understand the challenges
Right.
that law enforcement and prosecutors have to go through.
Right. And I think, well, no matter what, we'll have two new county commissioners in January. We just don't know in one of the races who it will be. But the county commissioners, like city councilmen, like congressmen and senators, they bring to the job their background and their experience. And I am always happy to have somebody in those positions who understands what we do. And I'm sure the sheriff is as well. And but even if they don't know anything about it, even if they come from maybe a real estate background or a farming background, the county commissioner's job is so multifaceted. They have to know a little about everything, whereas the sheriff and the prosecutor and the coroner have to know a lot about one thing. And it works pretty well. I think they, in Twin Falls anyway, they accept our advice and counsel, and they accept that we know our job better than they will know our job. But they work with us on the budget, obviously.
And you think about that though, when the methamphetamine epidemic first hit, and you had to go to them and say, probably we need more resources because of this, they understood. But there's two of these men running right now that would definitely understand because they've been out on the front lines against it as well. And so there are people who bring unique experiences
Mhm.
into a particular position that would favor your office in that sense.
Perhaps, but I mean, you never know until you bring the issue to them. I mean, I would never assume that because, for instance, Don Hall has a background as a policeman that I could just go in and know that he's going to vote with me because I'm law enforcement. I would have to make my case and make it carefully and argue it responsibly in order to expect that I would get anything in the way of a increase in a budget for something like what you just mentioned, like lots of methamphetamine coming to the valley. But over the years, there have certainly been times when I felt that we needed more money and there's not enough money, and so we don't get it. But by and large, I've found that I've gotten a good hearing, and that if I make a good case, then uh, they grant me the money to do what my office needs to do.
Of course, in Don's case, as you mentioned, you got to be a good generalist. As he once told me, he said prior to being elected to the city council, he would not have known much about wastewater management, but now he knows these things. And
Sure.
there's a little bit to be said about experiences that people do bring to a particular office.
Right. And, an office like mine or the sheriff's or the coroner's or the treasurer, the assessor, I mean, they don't necessarily need to bring a broad range of experience to do a job that's fairly well defined. But the commissioner's job is so general that it's good to have different people from different backgrounds there, and each one brings a little bit of different perspective, and I think that's a good thing.
I want to thank Grant Loebs for dropping by today. Coming up on 10 o'clock, Rush Limbaugh will be along following the news from Fox. Bill Colley with you as well, saying, God willing, the creek don't rise. They'll allow me to come back and do this all over again tomorrow morning between 8 and 10 o'clock right here on News Radio 1310 KLIX and NewsRadio1310.com.